We absolutely support Israel's right to defend itself in line with international law.
We need to safeguard financial stability.
2024 is not going to be an easy year.
We used to call it the dream of home ownership, but look at Britain now.
We've got to hang on to optimism and hope because it is the biggest driver of change.
Let's stop thinking of life in terms of Brexit. Let's move on and look to the future.
You're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Stephen Carroll.
And I'm Caroline Hepker. Welcome to the programme. So, Davos is over. Now, really, the agenda is looking towards the March budget. And it's all about whether or not the government is going to be able to cut taxes or not.
Yeah, both Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt putting pen to paper over the weekend in the Sunday papers, talking about tax cuts. Rishi Sunak writing in The Sun on Sunday saying the choice is clear. Tax cuts with us or tax rises with Keir Starmer. So already, even though we are, it's a solid sort of 6 weeks away from the budget on March the 6th, it does seem like that drumbeat around tax cuts is getting louder. There is a stage in this process that will happen this week, which is when the Office for Budget Responsibility will give their first assessment to the Chancellor of how much money he might have to spend in that budget. So various reports around that, as the Financial Times saying today that the Chancellor could get as much as £10 billion extra because of lower borrowing costs. So that's something factoring into those decisions as well. But perhaps also might be behind this ramping up of promises around more tax cuts.
The thing is, in economic terms, that's hardly anything at all. And we were speaking to the Corporation of London's policy chair this morning, Chris Hayward, who was saying, of course, we're in favour of tax cuts. Who isn't? If you ask me that question, it's how the government goes about doing that. And there are still so many perils around doing that, and whether that then upsets, investors and creates a whole sort of mini budget storm, as with Liz Truss. The other factor in all of this too, which I think is quite interesting. So there's also this argument, that if you keep taxes high, does that send all of the wealth creators, all of the people that might create jobs and open new business, does that
drive
send them
out
fleeing to other countries? I like the fact the London School of Economics has come out again, which with some research into this, saying that actually the super rich are unlikely just to desert us because of high tax rates. It doesn't quite work like that. And this is a very different perspective maybe from the 70s, 80s, 90s, when that was always the argument, that people who create new businesses are going to go if taxes are too high.
I quite enjoyed some of the quotes in that research, not just good economics, actually saying the UK's deep-rooted wealthiest, so take from that what you will as a definition, are reluctant to move over tax, calling tax havens boring and culturally barren.
Okay, we won't name any
no,
of them.
No, indeed. How rude is what I thought in response to that. But so that's sort of one end of the scale when it comes to the tax cuts prospect. The other one is there was a tax cut announced in the autumn statement, the national insurance cut, which a lot of people will be experiencing for the first time in their pay packets due in the next couple of days. But apparently, according to a YouGov poll in the Times, 62% of voters believe the government should be prioritising spending on more public services rather than cutting taxes. The question of how much impact did that tax cut actually have? And the paper reports that Tory strategists are concerned that 2% cut to national insurance basically hasn't had an impact on voters. People haven't felt like it was something that gave them a boost. Now, many of them, as I say, won't have seen it because it's from the start of this year, but it is an interesting thought that they spent £9 billion on this. And does it actually have that much of an impact about how people feel about
Okay, but that may be a time lag, as you say. But also, are Britain's problems, are the problems of voters only about money, or is it about more than just that? To which Keir Starmer's speech today, I think, is very interesting. So he's been speaking at this civil society summit about his vision for the voluntary sector. It was billed as this reset for the relationship between government and civil society. And he was asking also for the support of these charities and other organisations and their input into Labour's plan, what Starmer calls, a mission-led government. I want you to firstly just have a listen to him setting out this vision for Britain's society in the speech today.
Who recognised that the government couldn't and shouldn't do everything by themselves, and that civil society and faith groups play a unique and vital role in this country, building the relationships and the shared values that shape our national life. The relationship between government and civil society needs a reset.
So a reset, says Starmer. There wasn't a huge amount of policy, but this I did pick out as incredibly important. The Labour leader promising to halve violence against women and girls in the next decade.
Yeah, and thoughts around the interaction between civil society and the government. Not a new idea for government. In fact, it sounded remarkably similar to this speech.
The big top-down government solutions to every problem, that isn't working anymore, and so it is time to try something different. And I think the idea of the big society is trying to help individuals and communities and voluntary bodies to come together and find solutions to the problems that we have, whether it is the provision of good schools or feeling you want to improve your neighbourhood or whatever. But yes, so that's the big idea, is that you're looking for big society answers rather than big state answers.
So that was David Cameron launching his Big Society project back in 2010. Keir Starmer had some similar thoughts today.
One Conservative Prime Minister said there was no such thing as society. And then we watched individualism run rampant. Cameron talked about the big society. A great idea in principle. But when austerity kicked in, we ended up with the poor society.
So that was Keir Starmer. Let's speak now to Phillip Blond, who is the director of the think tank ResPublica and actually one of the architects of David Cameron's Big Society project. So really great to have you on the Bloomberg radio podcast programme this morning. What do you think that David Cameron, now back in government, would actually make of not just a kind of nod, but even a sort of credit to his Big Society idea in this vision that's been set out by the Labour leader?
Well, I think it remains pertinent because what we have now, which I've always argued, is we have a state that doesn't work and we have a market that doesn't work. So we've got an enormous amount of social problems that can't really be reached by the state. You know, I think I coined a phrase, the state can't love you. And the fundamental solution to many of our problems are people looking after other people. And that's around neighbourhood, that's around loneliness, that's around checking up on people, and so on and so forth. And so the Big Society was an attempt to kind of restore social capital, if you forgive the awful phrase, to people, because a lot of the evidence has shown that in developed societies, people are becoming more isolated, more lonely, have less and less contact with people. And we know that poorer people are lonelier than richer people. People out of work are more isolated. And we know the cost of isolation. Michael Marmot's done some amazing work on kind of wider population health factors. And people die 20 years earlier in Blackpool than they do in Richmond. And they have over 10 years in living in ill health rather than good health. So it's all pretty extreme, really. So I think
what happened then with the Big Society project? Because it didn't seem to kind of live up to its promise.
I think that's correct. It did not. I think George Osborne happened to the Big Society. And Osborne's a very clever man who only unfortunately had one idea, which was austerity. And in a way, to make the Big Society work requires more investment. And you can't sort of just cut away the state. You've got to try to create a state that is more permeable, that can be better colonized by people. So think of our GPs units today. You can't control how your GP practice services you. You have no real power over how they relate to people ringing up. Hopefully they're good, but many are not good. Similarly, you can't control your school. Your school can be pushing through all sorts of extreme ideology, even at primary school. And as a parent, if you're in a state school, you can't do anything about it. So I think sort of if one was trying to do Big Society again, you would try to I don't like the phrase democratise, because whenever you use it, it achieves the opposite of what's intended. But you've got to give parents more control of schools, patients more control of doctors, and essentially give to the ordinary person some ability for them to control the services that the state delivers to them. We got police and crime commissioners in for the police, but again, that hasn't made any real difference. The police are still pretty woeful across the board. So my sense is now we've got an enormous majority of people who are very unhappy with all manner of state provision, and we've no way to integrate them with the state. And the big society was an attempt to do that. And for me, it was too hostile to the state, which is why it didn't work. And then coupled with austerity, that became the only message of the Cameron government, really.
Yeah, and we're at a point now where, local authorities across the country, a big number of them, who deliver a lot of local services that you talk about, are facing potential bankruptcy. We've already seen 5 or 6 in the last couple of years. And there is an enormous sort of issue of financing all of this. And Labour talking about wanting a mission-led government. But the number one problem is going to be cash.
Well, this is where, if you look at what the councils are spending their money on, it's social care. It's people basically unable to look after their parents. Many of these people perhaps don't have children, or don't have children who are able or willing to try to work for a more at-home solution. So they go into very expensive institutional care that is often horrific. And this is why old people live in fear of going into care, because nobody cares for you in care. That's the problem. And then think of family breakdown. An enormous amount of money is spent by local authorities on the consequences of family breakdown, domestic abuse, often by the non-natural father. A child is most at risk from the male partner that isn't the child's natural father. That's where most of the killings and harm comes to children come from. And so there's an enormous financial cost borne by everybody from our social breakdown. So there's got to be some sense of trying to tackle that social breakdown, because then you tackle the cause of many of these present problems. But currently, nobody's doing that.
A big strain of that sounds like, I'll say it frankly, blaming women for the problems of society. I mean, women largely do the lion's share of unpaid work. Very difficult to have women working as the government and others want, and we have a high proportion of women who do that, but also, doing that heavy lifting in terms of care within society. That seems to be what I'm hearing from that.
Yeah, I think that's in your mind, not in mine, or not in what I've said. I think that family breakdown I'm not applying any gender or sex specific criticism there. It's just a fact. And similarly, care for the elderly. I think you're assuming that care has to be delivered by women. I'm not, but you're right in the sense that most care is delivered by women.
Do you think that Keir Starmer's speech, or that this idea, that he has laid out of a decade of national renewal, of, he's repeated some of the phrases that, frankly, Cameron and the Conservatives were using, the social contract, a society of service, growing the economy in all parts of the country, a mission-led government, pointing to the failure of 14 years of Conservative government to make things better in the UK, according to Starmer. But actually, it's not a different vision. It's just sort of saying that we will be able to deliver it. Do you think that catches fire? Is there anything different from what Cameron was laying out? Can it be achieved if the Tories haven't done it?
look, Blur said something similar. I think almost every PF has said something similar and never enacts it because the logic of our system takes over. So I think the trouble with Labour is that the culture war element of Labour, the trans agenda, the enforcement of that in schools will destroy any attempt at kind of wider social cohesion, and it will once more be an upper middle class war of progressive values, if we can call it that, upon non-progressive majorities. And that's where I fear the balance in Labour is going to sort of lead to. But I hope not. I mean, in this sense, I want Labour to succeed because the problems Starmer has named are real. But I don't see any genuine social policy or any genuine attempt to meet them. So I think, I fear it's just words, I'm afraid.
Okay. Phillip Blond, Director of ResPublica, thank you very much for joining us with your views on the subject of Keir Starmer's speech today.
Well, let's turn our attention then to funding, because 44 Conservative MPs have written to the Prime Minister asking for more funds for local councils. In a year set for both local and general elections, it's a worrying sign. Conservative leader of the Derbyshire County Council, Barry Lewis, joins us now to discuss. Barry, very good to have you on Bloomberg Radio. We've been talking about actually the extent of local authority difficulties for some time, totting up the number of councils that have effectively said that they've gone bankrupt. Just tell us, in your view, what you think the scale of the issues are affecting local finance.
Well, this year is pretty colossal in real terms because of the inflationary pressures that local authorities face and increased demand on things like adult social care and in particular children's services. So there's a overspend across the upper tier authorities in this year of around £650 million, which is not insignificant. And of course, in the autumn statement, no announcement of new money, so it's putting local authorities under real pressure, particularly since 2010. Billions have been saved right across the sector, and in our instance, in Derbyshire County Council, over £300 million in that time. So it's becoming really, really challenging at the moment.
Now, these are issues that you've laid out what the current crunch point comes from as well. How big a change needs to come around in? Is this a temporary issue, or is the structural issue around funding for local government need to be completely overhauled? And from your point of view, what would that mean in terms of the amount of money that you'd need?
Okay, so local authorities are constantly having to look at how they operate and become more efficient and more effective in the way they run their businesses effectively. And so there is a structural longer term element. So we need to have a real look at in the longer term at local authority funding and how it is funded and so on. But in particular, the last 12 months, we all know about 18 months of the inflationary pressures that have been extraordinary, and that's particularly on local authorities.
Okay, there's a general election coming up. Obviously, as a Conservative, the leadership in Westminster is talking about tax cuts. Are you in favour of having tax cuts if that means not being able to further fund local councils?
Well, absolutely. I mean, where we have residents right across the country are also feeling the pinch in their pockets as well. We don't want to put an extra burden on residents. As I said, as I've already mentioned, local authorities are as lean and mean as they can be at this moment in time. But there is a real need to start thinking about how we, as local authorities, sort of deliver those services that the general public really want and need. And it's the statutory stuff, it's the children's services, which cost a huge amount of money and has put a huge pressure on the system at the minute. But the what seems to be altogether mundane, but is really, really felt out there on our streets, and that's the issue of things like pothole repairs and so on, a real national issue at the moment, as we all know. So there is a real need to make sure that local authorities are funded correctly.
Okay, but you can't have both, surely. I mean, it's incredibly tight, the headroom that the Chancellor has got. He's going to have very, very little. Surely, when the forecast is that more local councils are going to go bust in the next 12 months, and that has been, the local government authority have talked about that, a number of times, there's going to be a real crunch point in the next 12 months.
Yeah, that's true. That's true, and I think this is a really careful balancing act about where we spend money elsewhere in the system as well. But he did identify that there is a larger fiscal headroom than he had initially anticipated. That 13 billion that was identified in the autumn statement. So we believe there is a little bit of headroom in there. But I think it's quite clear the passion that's felt even amongst MPs to be writing 40 odd to the Prime Minister is pretty much unprecedented around local government funding. Realization that the delivery arm of government on the ground is local authorities.
Well, as the leader of a county council, then how do you want to see that money being spent? Does it need to go only into local services? Because you can't have everything. There's money, but there's not a huge amount of money to go around.
Very true, very true. I think, as I say, at the end of the day, it's the government to do the balancing act, and we're hearing that the representations that are being made by both local authorities and MPs are beginning to land well on the Chancellor and the Prime Minister, and hopefully that will translate into some action. We do understand right across the sector that, and we are, as I say, always challenging where we can be leaner and meaner across the system, but there is a balance to be struck, and that balance, obviously needs to be worked through by government. But as I say, ultimately, people value their services.
Yes, absolutely. The problem is that 1 in 5 council leaders in England who have been surveyed by the LGA say that they are going to be out of money after the autumn statement. Is Derbyshire County Council, fiscally robust? Are you one of the councils that is close to 114, or is that a distant prospect from your point of view?
It is a more distant prospect for us. I mean, we made an announcement that we were looking at potential in-year deficit of 46 million. We're working that down at the moment. We have a problem longer term going on, potentially 39.5 million. And this is what I mean for the next year. That is, this is what I mean by we're constantly challenging and pushing, because we've now got to save that 39.5 billion out of our budget next year to make sure we can balance it. And we're going to do that. Putting in all the necessary actions, etc. It's going to be a real challenge.
What concretely does it?
I was going to say that's a challenge faced by a lot of local authorities at the moment.
Yeah, so just concretely for people living in your council area, what services will not be available to them because of that deficit?
There's nothing at the moment that we're looking at. It's a consultation as well, so it's reprofiling particular services so they become slightly more efficient. It means that we'll be doing some less in some areas. We're challenging every area of spend right across the local authority. But it may be that certain grant schemes are going to have to be eliminated. We're looking at this is the perversity of it. We're looking at things like early help services in adult social care and in children's services, which we may have to reduce or cut. And if we do that, that then puts further pressure on the system further down the line. So this is what I mean about this balancing act that we're having to do as a local authority, and as I say, in common with many local authorities right across the country.
Do some of your statutory obligations for service provision need to be removed then? If there simply isn't enough money to go around, do you need to be given more flexibility about those spending choices?
If you look at the statutory services that we run around children's services, our highway statutory responsibilities, all those sorts of things, we will still continue to deliver that. It doesn't mean that you can't challenge things around statutory services to make them more efficient, to make them run at less cost, etc. But that ultimately requires hard decisions along the way. But it is something that we can do.
Yeah. In terms of how you're going to make the case at local and national elections for a new mandate for the Conservative Party, how hopeful are you that you can convince voters after 14 years at national level in government to give the Conservatives another go. I mean, we were just listening to Keir Starmer this morning, sort of laying out what he sees as 10 years of national renewal, so making a clear pitch really for 2 terms of a Labour government. How hopeful are you about being able to win in local and national elections?
Well, we've got to do our best, I guess, both as local authorities and as councillors and as MPs across the piece. What I'm not hearing from the Labour Party is any clear direction and plan about how they are going to make a difference, for example, in local government. I was on TV just a few days ago with a prospective parliamentary candidate for the Labour Party who couldn't articulate a plan for what the Labour Party are going to do once they get government. So, I think it's going to be a real challenge for whoever is in government, and I think that has been openly admitted by all. But ultimately, it's down to how we deliver, and that's the case we're trying to make, both as Conservative local authorities and leaders, but also nationally as a Conservative party.
I wonder how much the local story, though, will come up on the doorsteps running up to that general election as well. Will people be most worried about their local services disappearing when it comes to choosing their MP?
To an extent. I think the big story on the doorstep at this time of year in particular is the one that's around potholes more than anything else. As long as we can keep emptying the bins, dealing with the waste, making sure that young people are safe and well educated and well fed, etc., and our elderly are well looked after in settings that they need to be looked after in, and that the potholes and the roads and the highways are in as good condition as they can be. That's the basic job of local government, and that's the one that we want to try and excel at, but it's very difficult in these circumstances.
OK, Barry Lewis, thank you so much for being with us, Conservative leader of Derbyshire County Council. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, that's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe and give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by James Wilcock. Our audio engineer was Marufal Hussain. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.